Okay, shall I begin? One more minute. Yeah. Yeah, let's begin. Yeah. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening. Welcome back. Today we have two speakers, Christopher Buckels and CZ. First speaker will be Dr. Christopher Buckels. He has published valuable articles in renowned journals such as Phronesis and Plato and Ancient Philosophy. And he's going to give a talk on images in Republic 5 to 7 in light of the Timaeus. Okay, Dr. Buckels, yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me at the conference. I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm also going to drop a link to the paper in the chat. Oh, if I can get the chat to show up again. Here we go. It's also in the packet there, but if it's easier to follow along this way, then feel free to use that. I will not have the entire paper displayed up here, but I'll have parts of it up here. So we should take Plato seriously, I'm going to argue, when he describes the sensible world as an image of the intelligible world, as he does clearly in the Timaeus. The universe, taken as a whole, is an image in both the Timaeus, or it's an image of an internal changeless model. In both the Timaeus and Republic, forms are intelligible and non-spatio-temporal, but they appear as images do in certain places at certain times. Today, I'll take those appearances to be tropes. Recent scholarship has discussed such a trope-theoretic interpretation in the Timaeus and Phaedo, but not in Plato's flagship dialogue. Today, I'll argue that a trope-theoretic reading of the central books of the Republic offers good explanation of several problematic passages listed on the screen there. These readings also tie the Republic into a middle position between the Phaedo and the Timaeus in terms of Plato's unfolding articulation of the visible world as an image of the intelligible. So first I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what it means to take Plato to have a trope bundle theory. So when we're talking about the relation between form and form image, right, we're often thinking the relation between form and sensible particular, right, where we take forms to be non-spatial temporal paradigms, or I'll take them also as abstract properties or universal properties. And then sensible particulars are the things like all the participants in this conference, the computers that we're all staring at right now, the other things in the room where you're sitting, all of those are sensible particulars. I am going to instead take this relation to be, instead of sensible particulars, with tropes, right? I think if we take forms as properties, universal properties, then their images should be particular instances of properties, right? So the roughness of a particular redwood tree's bark is a roughness trope, which is an image of the form roughness, if there is such a form. Similarly, the treeness of a redwood tree is an image of treeness itself. We could also talk about these as shares, right? So in the Phaedo, we get the language of sharing instead. So the roughness of the bark is a share of roughness itself. And this share is in a particular place at a particular time. The roughness trope perishes if the redwood's rough outer bark is scraped down to its smooth inner bark. The form roughness, on the other hand, never perishes, since it's a non-spatial temporal entity that explains the fact that each share or image of itself is rough. And I want to make sure we're on the same page that this is not anachronistic, because Plato talks about form images and form shares, and all I'm doing in calling them tropes is offering contemporary metaphysicians an avenue into the discussion that we're having of Plato's metaphysics. So if form images are tropes, then sensible particulars are bundles of tropes. That is, particulars may be fully decomposed into their constituent properties. The redwood is composed of its treeness, roughness, all these that you see, When certain tropes are present in a certain space, there's an object in that space. In terms borrowed from the Timaeus, some tropes compose a bundle if they are co-located in the receptacle. Consistency of a natural kind trope in the bundle, such as the kind sequoia, serves to ensure identity over time. So a redwood is the same tree so long as the tropes that compose it include a treeness trope or a sequoia trope. And this avoids giving Plato substratum to particulars that would rival forms in its independent existence. Okay, so now let's apply this to these passages that I mentioned. So I'm going to follow Gosling and Meinwald in my interpretation of the sight lovers argument, which means that the sight lovers are the sort of people who learn about beautiful, fine, splendid things and actions from examples that are often culturally prominent but don't have to be. Right? For example, a playgoer may classify a behavior as splendid after seeing it enacted in grand fashion on the stage. The important point is that these experts identify particular context-dependent qualities as what makes certain things better or worse. Blinding himself may be a fitting and even noble action on Oedipus's part, but it is not for Antigone. These connoisseurs scoff at the idea that one thing explains why each item in their field is better or worse. In fact, thinking so would make one uneducated. Thus, when the sight lover agrees that the many beautifuls each on occasion appear ugly, it's no surprise. Each quality that makes an action beautiful on the stage makes another action ugly in another context. Socrates, in contrast, argues that there is one form of beauty. There appear to be many different reasons why things are beautiful because beauty is shared in actions and bodies. There's a share of beauty in the noble action of a Girl Scout helping an old man across the street, as well as in the girl herself if her noble action is indicative of a noble character. Socrates thus affirms that there's one thing present in all beautiful, noble, or splendid things, a share of beauty or an image of beauty. Each share of beauty is a particular instance of beauty. For example, the nobility of the girl's action. So each is a trope of beauty. As the connoisseur insists, different reasons explain why this particular action of this particular girl are noble. And these explanations need not apply to any other instance of nobility. But Socrates insists that beauty may be defined. There are necessary and sufficient conditions for the existence or non-existence of any particular instance of beauty. Several lines later, Socrates gives examples of beautiful things. These examples support Gosling's type reading of the many beautifuls, since shapes, colors, and voices are hardly standard examples of particulars. But the passage also asserts that some beautiful things are made out of shapes and colors, echoing the claim in the Timaeus that things are composed of heat and whiteness and other properties with opposites. The reasoning behind the assertion in the Republic appears straightforward. For example, a costume in a play is constructed from beautiful shapes and colors, and a scene in the play will have beautiful shapes, colors, and voices as components. This reasoning assumes that properties, not smaller objects, are components of complex particulars, such as costumes, and of actions, such as someone's acting out the scene in a play. Socrates next claims that those who believe in the many beautifuls rather than one form of beauty are like dreamers, who cannot tell that a likeness of something is a likeness rather than the original. This passage evokes the Timaeus. An image does not have the very thing for which it comes to be. As Chernus paraphrases, an object or an image is always an image of something. It is not itself what it depicts. The philosopher doesn't confuse a form with its image, but can distinguish the original from the image. The sight lover can't. A particular shade of red in a costume makes it beautiful in a certain context. A different shade may be more beautiful in a different context. But philosophers recognize beautiful colors of a costume as images of beauty, as well as images of whatever other forms are relevant. For example, a beautiful red has a redness that's an image of the form of redness, if there is such a form, and a beauty that's an image of the form beauty. The sight lover's argument famously assigns objects of opinion to a mixed ontological status. While the objects of knowledge are, and the objects of ignorance are not, the objects of opinion lie between. The Timaeus similarly makes forms the objects of knowledge, since knowledge requires an immutable object, and it assigns the items of becoming, which are images of forms, to opinion. Back in the Republic, the expert opinions of the sight lovers are based on the possession or non-possession of certain properties in certain circumstances. For example, the costume is beautiful because it is red, and red fits beautifully in the circumstances of the play. This means that tropes are the objects of opinion. Appropriately, they are and are not, since they come to be and perish. Since each F trope is F whenever it is, tropes are F when they exist and are not F when they do not exist. Forms are because the form of F exists immutably. Particulars, on the other hand, are not, because they are bundles, not things. They are composed of tropes, which are F, but particulars themselves are not F, since they are not identical to the tropes out of which they are composed. They seem F because they contain F tropes. Going back to the example, the costume, strictly speaking, is not red. Its redness trope is red, making the bundle, the costume, seem red. Of course, this reality is not reflected in the way we talk, and Timaeus tells us not to talk the way we do, right? But the reason it's not reflected in the way we talk is because we are often not even at the epistemological level of sight lovers, as Socrates shows us in the images of the line and the cave. I'm going to use my own drawing here because drawings of the cave are notoriously debated. So hopefully no one can hold me to the hand-drawn one I've got here. Socrates sets up an analogy as a key to the line. As objects of opinion are to objects of knowledge, so images are to originals. Thus, the distinction between the second and first segment, particulars and their shadows, which are originals and images, is like the distinction between particulars and forms, which are also images and originals. The third segment bridges the second and fourth. Items of the third segment are images of originals in the fourth segment, but the third segment uses originals of the second segment as images. The difference between the second and third segments then is not ontological, they're not different objects, but epistemological. In the second segment, particulars are viewed as sensible originals, but in the third segment, they're viewed as intelligible images. Let's see how taking form images to be tropes bridges this gap. We, right, as Socrates tells us, we are at the first level of the line, eikasia, since the cave's prisoners are like us. Ordinary people experience sensible objects in the world and assume that they are real. We assume the computers are real and the other people at the conference are real. We are like prisoners mistaking shadows for real things. For example, the costume is a bundle of redness, of beauty, and so on, but we take it to be a unified, concrete, real object. Timaeus warns readers against mistaking sensibles for real things. Do not call fire real, because only its fieriness is real. The apparent object that is now fiery could at any moment become extinguished. Not only do we focus on images rather than originals when we're at the line's first stage, but we also confuse images with one another. Seeing the red costume as beautiful, we don't distinguish its redness and its beauty, or we don't distinguish them from the object themselves. We think they are simply aspects of the costume. Vision tricks us into thinking that the costume is real, when it's actually composed of images of real things. We are like prisoners, mistaking shadows for real things. Those who focus on tropes as parts of sensibles are closer to the truth. They have pistis. Most people mix properties together in perception. Sight lovers, in contrast, recognize that their objects of concern are composed of qualities. They develop theories as to which qualities are best and most beautiful in what combinations, and thus they have opinions about the many beautifuls. They might see the spin of a quark, that it's essential to its They might see that the spin of a quark is essential to its ability to compose a proton, and thus essential to material objects having the properties they do. Thus, sight lovers are actually a step closer to the truth than most of us. These experts are like freed prisoners on the way out of the cave who look at statues and are told that they are more real than the shadows cast on the wall. But thinking that statues are real is still mistaking an image for a real thing, as the prisoner discovers outside the cave. There, the freed prisoner is able to see real things, first as reflections in water. These reflections are recognized as reflections. They are not confused with the real things themselves. At this third level of the line, dianoia, mathematicians and theoretical physicists and the like are able to study universal laws through representative instances of properties. They focus on tropes as images of forms, recognizing that they are but images of a larger reality. And finally, the philosopher studies that reality itself, the fourth level of the line. The freed prisoner is finally able to look at the natural world itself without the mediation of images, leaving tropes behind to focus on forms, thus reaching episteme. Philosophers remember reflections in water, they remember statues in the cave, they remember the shadows on the wall, and thus they are able to see why those appeared as they did, because they now know the real things that are the originals of those images. Philosophers thus gain the ability to recognize images of forms even when mixed together in actions and bodies. And this, of course, brings us to the infamous two-world problem. Knowledge must be infallible, and so its objects must be immutable, while particulars are subject to change, and so not suitable objects of knowledge. But given that the rulers have to make decisions about sensible particulars, they rule particular people, not the form of people, how can philosophers' opinions be preferable to judgments of non-philosophers? Plato clearly presupposes that philosophers do judge particulars better than non-philosophers. Socrates tells the rulers that they'll see better in the dark cave, and they'll be able to recognize what each image is and of what it is an image, because they have seen the truth about beautiful and just and good things. They are not dreamers, like sight lovers, who confuse images and originals. Philosophers have seen goodness itself. They can recognize images of goodness, and thus they know which actions share in goodness, since they know that each action is an image, and moreover, that it is an image of goodness. In order to justify this claim, however, there must be something about the action itself that indicates that it shares in goodness. A trope bundle theory holds that particulars are constituted by form images, and so philosophers know the originals of these images, and thus have indirect grasp of the constituents of the particulars they encounter. For example, since philosophers know what it is to be good, and since a good act is constituted in part by an image of goodness, they are able to recognize the goodness in a good act. They recognize qualities of an act in a particular set of circumstances that meet the definition of a good act. In other words, they recognize the tropes upon which a trope of goodness supervenes. Thus, knowledge of the form secures or justifies one's true opinion about the presence of a form image in any given particular. Although knowledge of forms allows reliable and justified judgments about particulars, philosophers cannot thereby have knowledge of particulars, since form images are transitory and thus not suitable objects of knowledge. While the unpredictable nature of tropes and perception prevents the philosopher from having knowledge of particulars, their judgments are much more reliable than those of ordinary people, sight lovers or experts, or even mathematicians. This supplies the philosopher with their basis for rule, as they're able to recognize reliably which actions are truly good and just, rather than those actions which simply seem good and just. Philosophers do not confuse images and originals. They are awake, while others are merely dreaming their way through life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buckels, for this wonderful presentation. I liked your drawings.
Thank you. Easier than finding something.
Do we have questions? Yeah, Sun Yu-jung.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. First is about this term you used, tropes. I can see why you need to use this term, and you might have already explained it, and I didn't get that point. Does it tell anything more than just image? Well, why do you feel that we need to use this term, or does it help anything in your bundle theory? This is my first question. I have a second one. Is about the bundle theory. If I understand correctly, what you're saying is that since sensible things, or for example, a table, is not F, it's not tableness. So because it is a bundle, like a bunch of qualities. But in this case, if it is just a bundle, it's just a conoyad of quality. How can we ask about what it really is? What I mean is, it's not just a bunch of qualities. They are organized in some way. So some qualities or some definition is more important than others. So how do you explain this?
Thank you. Yeah, so one of the reasons I use the word trope is just to make connections to what metaphysicians are doing now, so that we can, I think, put Plato's theory in dialogue with contemporary theories. And I think that both interpreting Plato and looking at the contemporary theories can be improved this way. But also, I think it has an emphasis that image doesn't, right? Because we're able to debate whether images of forms are properties or particulars, right? Whether the table is an image of tableness, or whether the tableness of the table is an image of tableness. And so if I specify that form images are tropes, then it takes that that debate out there, or at least I'm showing that I'm going one way in that debate rather than the other way. And then you bring up a good question about the structure of bundles. So I think there are going to be more important tropes, more important images in any particular bundle. So for the example with the tree, the kind sequoia is what organizes a redwood tree. So that is the natural kind trope determines what other kinds of tropes can and cannot be part of that particular bundle. In the Timaeus, we see this with fire, right? So fire has a particular structure, and so it has to have certain kinds of triangles. It can't have the triangles that make up Earth. It's got to have all the other kinds of triangles, and they have to be arranged in a certain way. So you could think of the kind, fire or redwood or whatever, as a kind of structural property that organizes the other properties.
Thank you. Somehow that seems very Aristotelian for me.
I'm hoping that it doesn't seem very Aristotelian, actually, because I don't think that I think that Aristotle is committed to the fact that things are real, right? So I look around and I look at a water bottle, and it's a real thing that exists independently of its properties, and it has those properties. Whereas I don't think Plato thinks that. I think for Plato, the water bottle is, something that we perceive, but it doesn't have that reality, right? At most, it's a conglomeration of images.
Yes, of course, I understand. What I mean is that the way that you explain how in the bundle something is more important, or there is principal kind, these are terms that Plato never used, but Aristotle tend to use, like there are substance in other qualities.
Yeah, so I would put a lot of emphasis on the Timaeus looking, when the demiurge is looking at the form of the living thing, right? And it contains all the intelligible living things in it, right? So I take that to be all animal species, right? So there we get natural kind forms. We also get this, looked at in the Parmenides when Socrates is wondering whether it's a form of man, an ox, and fire. We get in the Phaedo the form of fire and snow. And then, of course, later in the Timaeus, we get the four elements. So I think that these are really, I'm leaning on these to get the natural kind tropes and forms and the importance of those in structuring the world. And I think that it's just it's really important to think that the looking at the form of the living thing is how the world is structured in Timaeus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lee Jun-Yup, Dr. Lee?
If so, the structural properties you mentioned is a kind of a hierarchy between properties within a particular. Is it?
Yes.
Is it?
Yes, I think so. So I think there'll be some, for example, Socrates' humanity, right, is an image of what it is to be human, and that indicates that he has to have some sort of skin color, let's say, but when he spends the day in the sun, he has a darker skin color, so he loses one trope and gains another, and that's all consistent with the kind human being.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Another question? Do we have any other questions?
No one's going to press me on the points in the Republic.
Tomohiko Kondo.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for your illuminating talk. My question is, I'd like to know a little bit more about what you say about the concept of supervenience, that is, and the difference between the recognition of the philosophers and the sight lovers. That is, you said that the philosophers recognize the tropes upon which a trope of goodness supervenes.
Mm-hmm.
But you also argues that sight lovers can recognize which qualities are most beautiful in what combinations. What is the difference between these two knowledge or recognitions?
So I take it that the sight lovers gain that through a kind of habitual experience. So they go to the plays often, and so they see what works in a particular play and what doesn't. In this way, we might think of the kind of the knack of the Empiria and the Gorgias, right? That they're gaining these experiential, what we probably today would call knowledge, right? But Plato wouldn't call knowledge of what kinds of things are beautiful and what kinds of context. Whereas the philosophers will actually know whatever the definition of beauty is, and so they'll be able to see where there's actual where tropes are configured such that you actually get beauty or goodness. And I'm not sure if Plato works this out in great detail about those forms as he does about, for example, fire, where the philosopher would be able to know the definition of fire as certain kinds of triangles arranged in certain kinds of ways, and so be able to pick out fire from the other elements, theoretically at least. And I think that the same kind of account is supposed to go for goodness or beauty, but we don't get at least clear definitions of those, or I'd have to look around to see how those definitions would work out. Does that help?
Okay. We cannot hear you. Yeah.
Oh, you can't hear me?
No, Tomohiko.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. Oh, now we can hear you.
Thank you. And then you don't argue that the kind of the form of beauty would be reduced to the set of tropes. You don't argue that kind of direction.
No, but I think contemporary contemporary metaphysicians would want to go that way. They'd say, well, why do we even need beauty or goodness or anything? We can reduce it to the lower level. I don't think Plato is going to say that, given the prominence of such forms in the dialogues, but I do think he has the resources to do that about some things. So he might want to say there's no form of redness, for example, that it's just, a certain combination of light tropes, or So there is a kind of a way for him to go with a kind of more sparse trope theory there. But I think that certain kinds of tropes like natural kinds and these important ethical forms will be retained.
Thank you.